A big purple guy with a mask and an electric personality moves through the world, almost accidentally defeating his bad guys. Though throughout the psychedelic series, we find ourselves asking what is real, and is the Maxx truly the hero of his own story? Or at least the hero that he wants to be. Welcome to Detecting the Marvelous. We have an exciting week here with our incredible hosts, Matt Ardell, Dan Rosen, and myself, Shaharah Ghaznavi. Thank you very much. How are you guys doing?
Woo, I'm
Woohoo,
great,
good.
thanks.
Oh
Yeah,
man,
and
that was an
yourself?
amazing intro.
Yeah, you nailed it. You nailed
I'm
it.
so glad.
I'm gonna need to start stepping up my intros because you guys are nailing yours.
Except I'm so Guyanese. I'm so Caribbean. And I said the mask instead of the Max, and I'm like, oh dear, I've already started. It's like an accentist thing, basically.
I constantly keep doing that because he is the Max, but he's constantly talking about his mask. So
Absolutely.
it's a very I think
Yeah.
understandable mix up to have.
Yeah, it was funny because when I was telling my sister that we were doing the Max this week, she was like, "Oh, the Max, like the mask with Jim Carrey, that one." And I was like, "No, you're close enough." But he wears a mask. Yeah, no, I get it.
Yeah. Although that is a comic too, so we could do that. It's a very
Ooh.
different comic than the movie, though.
Yeah, how are you guys doing?
Good. Yeah, just been
Doing
enjoying reading these comics, and then
yeah,
yeah.
really delving into my psyche with these ones. It's like
If this is your psyche, Dan, I'm a little concerned.
yeah, well, thankfully this isn't my psyche. I don't think. But who knows? But it is like one of those ones I think because it's so I think this was like the first comic that really like got me into like psychology and thinking about that kind of stuff and into the more less mainstream and more like psychedelic type comics. So like that's I do yeah, it was really cool to get into that and yeah, delve into that.
Yeah,
It's one of
thank you
the
for choosing this one. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, like this is one of the interesting parts coming out of the 90s. I know we are going to talk about some of the lows with Ben in an upcoming episode. But one of the highs I found was we pushed boundaries. So you got, stuff like this and Sandman, also by the same artist, uh,
Mm.
creating stories using the medium to tell things mature, but not necessarily like, oh, that's a mature story, but more of like a mature in a nuanced storytelling sense.
Yeah.
Not just like, oh, she's got boobies kind of thing. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so it's an actual more grown up and adult story, and that I thought was really cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
not just
very
like
yeah.
sorry, I was gonna say, yeah, instead of just being like, "Oh, this is mature because it's got swearing and female nudity," or kind of
Yeah,
thing. Yeah.
never male nudity,
That's true,
female
yeah.
nudity, yeah. Although I gotta see if I can track down that Batman issue, where you see Batman's ding dong. So, totally removed from market within a week. They're like,
Next
"What the
time
hell do we
on
do?"
Detecting the Marvelous.
Yeah, yeah.
Batman's ding dong.
Taking the marvelous ding dong of Batman, yeah.
No, but I think it was a very interesting exploration of trauma and we're gonna get into it. But I'm really excited for it. Matt, do you have a history lesson for us?
Yeah. So Sam Keith was first published by Comico Comics at 17 with a story about a rabbit named Max the Hare. That is some foreshadowing.
Oh.
So he really does tie his stories together. He went on to work on Mage and Fish Police as an inker before landing his role as the lead artist for Sandman, setting many of the iconic visuals and tones paired with Gaiman's words, creating a very surreal and I'd say it elevated the text because it was very dreamlike. But he only lasted the first story arc. He only lasted the first 5 issues. He equated it to being Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles. Um, he felt his style wasn't appropriate for the larger material. I think it was important to those early stages because it helped create um, a different tone, but also set the stage for them to use different artists for different story arcs, creating a variation in style that matches the story. Um, in 1992, some of the industry's biggest names got tired of working for hire with contracts where they created characters and stories but not owning them. So Image Studios was born, which became the third largest distributor of and creator of comics in the North American comics industry. In 1993, Sam Keith was part of the second wave of creators to join the label, bringing original creations to the title, including the main one being the Maxx. Um, and He left Marvel, where he at the time he was working on the Hulk. He's collaborated with a lot of great comic greats in the Mask. Sorry, I just did it in the Max. He wrote all 35 issues, but he had guest stints with Alan Moore and Bill Messner Loeb. Uh, Also collaborated with Alan Grant. He has touched on everything from the Aliens franchise to Batman and his Arkham Asylum madness. Which spent 2 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and has even done some Judge Dredd work. He produced and co-wrote the Max animated series on MTV back when MTV was doing weirdness like Aeon Flux. Um, he is a recipient of the San Diego Comic Con Inkpot Award in 2013, and I am looking forward to Channing Tatum's The Max film, which is actually happening. Not
Wow.
like his Gambit,
Finally.
but it is in he earlier or late last year. He said it is coming together and it's in pre-production.
So Channing Tatum as the Max.
I don't. He's producing it. I don't
Okay.
know if he's going to be the Max. I mean, he could be. Like, there's no
Yeah.
reason he couldn't. I think he's an underrated actor. But he's at least producing it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Well, that's cool because that was something that like when I read it, I was like, oh come on, I want this to be like I would love to see like the Max um yeah, a Max movie. Especially since the TV show basically only it ends after like 6 episodes, unfortunately. But yeah.
It'd have to be done in a way sort of like, I don't know if you watched the Legion TV show, which was
Yes.
I really liked because it kind of embraced the bonkers nature of the character, but it would
Yes.
have to
Yeah.
sort of lean into that. And I mean, it's sort of similar in themes, studying psychological trauma and dissociative disorders and that kind of thing. Um, but yeah, it'd have to sort of be like kind of surreal just by the
Oh.
nature of the book.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. I wonder what it would be like to cast somebody who we don't like know would be an unrecognizable character, so it stays true to the fact that we don't know what's underneath the Max's mask.
Yeah.
Um, and if anything, like if I feel like Channing Tatum would be a great cast for it. It would just be like what really does lie beyond that mask, and
Yeah.
is it something like I don't know, like would they change his face? Would they? Because that's a big mystery for me, and I think that's what makes it so compelling is that he's a
Mhm.
mystery to himself.
I
Yeah.
agree. I kind of do feel it's Max the Hare. I
Do you
think it
Right.
think so?
really is. Well, because he imagines himself with a bunny face.
Yeah.
Oh, you're
Um,
right.
and and you know, all these works tie in. Like, so when we get later on in the roundtable, I'll talk about some of his other works. But I think he's he's also really hates meat eaters, and he talks about how
Mm.
he can smell the meat on their breath and stuff. And he's a vegetarian,
Right. Yeah.
so I think he's a bunny
Yeah.
just
Have you have
wearing a mask.
have either of you read more beyond this first arc?
No, no.
No.
Okay.
But I've
Okay, cool, cool.
downloaded, like, the 100-page, annual and everything, so I'm 100% interested in continuing with this character.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, because I read I like I remember somehow a friend of mine lent me like the like all 6 volumes, and it's interesting because I think it was also unfortunately the run ended before he could do more, and like uh essentially like in the like sort of this first arc, like, or first main storyline with like the Max and Julie gets ended, and then something new kind of starts, but it, yeah, ends up, and I think then there's like a the Max and Friends or whatever. But if you put all volumes together, they did one where like it has like it completes an image of the Max as well,
Oh,
on
cool.
the like side, like sort of on the side of it. So when you have, so that way, like if you have it lined up in your comic book library, like I had when I was younger, then yeah, in high school. So
That's
yeah.
cool.
Well, Dan, do you want to tell us why you chose Max?
Yeah, so it was like in high school, I think it was around probably grade 12, and I had been, like I'd been reading, like a lot of like Spider-Man, Wolverine, the Hulk, Fantastic Four, Superman, Batman. So I was very much in the Marvel and DC world. And then I had someone personally recommended this to me, uh Steve Martin himself. A high school friend of mine named Steve Martin, not the actual very famous comedian.
Came in with a banjo. Is like,
Yeah, yeah,
Dan, you got
exactly.
to read this.
Yeah. For sure. Poor Steve got so much flack for having the same name as despite being a very funny person himself.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so anyhow, he was like, "Oh, you got to check out this comic book." And so he lent me like all 6 volumes, and yeah, I just like went through it super quickly, and it was very cool. Like it was one of those things where like we were both in the school play together, and so in between, like during after school rehearsals, we'd be like talking about like, oh yeah, like I just got to like this part and this thing and whatever. So it was just something that was like so different, and like you said, like it's so this like bonkers into someone's psyche, where I'm like, oh, like after reading like comic books where there are like the superhero stuff, which tends to be more traditional way of like, sort of having the story arcs and stuff, and it's a lot more straightforward and a lot less cryptic. I was like, oh, this is really cool to like read something that's like so cryptic and like can be very serious but also like very silly at some points too, but like understanding like, yeah, we're going to go into some like silly psyche stuff and acknowledge that yes, this is very like weird and wacky and out there. So I'll give a brief synopsis. I was trying to like synopsize everything, and it was like there's so much that happens because it's like you're talking about like characters being introduced and like it bouncing in between like the real world and Outback. And I think just in case, I think it's helpful to do a trigger warning here that there is a lot of talk about, like sexual assault in this series and violent stuff, but I do think the way it is discussed with is it's done in a very healthy, thoughtful way and not like exploitative for the sake of having like a dark, serious talk. I think Sam Keith is really trying to examine trauma and what it's like. Um, and so, yeah, it all starts off with the Max, our superhero, or at least he's, like thinking of himself as a superhero in this cardboard box with a very film noir style narration, but in a way that's kind of like, sort of like, we know he thinks in film noir style. And then every now and then he's like, oops, I'm actually speaking out loud. Uh,
Yep.
and that's why everyone always looks at me weird. Which, to be honest, also is like very much, I think, speaking towards like homelessness and mental illness, because like sometimes you walk by someone who's homeless and you hear them talking out loud with something that might be nonsense, but it obviously like, or sounds like you're like, what's this person going on about? Like this, quote unquote, like rambling crazy person, but it is like in that person's head, it all makes sense and it's them making sense of their situation. So he has this very like sort of like unhoused Batman, homeless Batman sort of vibe to him. Um, and so it's very early established. He's got these mental issues, and there's this like skinny head villain who's the real villain who is going after like women in the neighborhood, and who we later on found out his goes by the name of Mr. Gone. We meet Julie Winters, freelance social worker who gets called to bail Max out of jail and often gets commented on how like sort of provocatively she's dressed. Um, and there's people. and you see there's also these little characters that go meep meep called Izzes, like ISZ. These little like who often like basically like they're there almost to like annoy Max, and he chases after them, and they usually lead him to Mr. Gon, the bad guy, who calls him Brere Lapin, which I guess is kind of like a very loose, almost like sort of loose, basically translation of Brother Rabbit. Where so I think that's where he gets his like self image of the rabbit, as Matt mentioned. I also say that I do appreciate that with all the talk of sexual assault and sexual violence in it, they never show or like describe the details of it. It's you
Mhm.
see the after effects, the like psychological and physical after effects of it without it being gratuitous. So I do think it shows that he does have a respect for what he's talking about. Uh, and it kind of reminded me of recent movie that came out, Women Talking, where again, if you see that movie, you never see any of the actual violence. It's all just the aftermath and how it's affected the women in the story. And I think that's a much more respectful way instead of like uh, in film school. I remember like the student films always be like, oh, like we need to like guys being like, we need to do a dramatic story. I know, rape or whatever, you know. And so it is a much more like I think thoughtful approach to things. So then yeah, like and so there's this constant fighting between Max and Mr. Gon, and then he eventually also kidnaps Julie and ties her up. But you know, she doesn't even though she's like tied up in this weird outfit that he's kind of put her into, she doesn't give in to fear, and she eventually like breaks the straps and fights back against him. And like that issue 2 cuts like before you see like what she's done in a way similar to like we're eventually gonna talk to Ben about Wolverine number 90. uh Kind of reminded me of that. um and the Max is constantly trying to go out and say sort of basically he sees himself as like Julie's superhero. And what's interesting is when they talk about a lot of these darker issues of trauma and so on, Julie's saying like, oh, like sometimes she's almost like victim blamey. Like she's
Mm.
very like sort of like, oh, like you have to take care of yourself. You can't do this or whatever. But you can see she has her own trauma she's dealing with. And the Max is almost the one who's like putting out like feminist theory, being like, no, like that's blaming the victim. You got to like do this and so on. Um, there's also I do really appreciate there's a lot of like pop culture parody as when the Max is chasing in Iz through this alternate reality in his mind, the Outback, you see a spotted Susadon, which is like a ode to like, Dr. Seuss characters. Later on, there's like a Calvin and Hobbes looking kid who has
Mhm.
a stuffed ocelot Nietzsche instead of a stuffed tiger Hobbes. So there's a lot of these neat little like sort of nods to actual pop culture. Um, and the Max eventually is running through the Outback in issue 3. He gets like caught in a net and then like fights Mr. Gon in that realm. Yeah, and I don't want to actually go too much into it. Other than I'll say like in issue 4, there's a new character, Sarah, who's introduced, who wants to be a writer, and
Yeah.
her mom is friends with Julie, and she sometimes sees Julie as a for social work, and she wants to be a writer. And there were some fun lines where she says like writers are supposed to shock people, and I'm like, all right, edgelord comedian Sarah. Where like it's funny because yeah, she does talk about how like she was friends with this guy Jimmy who would beat up littler kids and take their money, which she thought was cool. So I was like, all right, maybe she is an edgelord comedian. But so she has this other like, and her dad, they show it like kind of looks like Mr. Gon. And so yeah, so there's a lot going on where it jumps in and out, and you start getting closer and closer to like what the trauma is that Julie has been pushing down, and what more clues about the Max, the trauma, because like he takes off his mask and sees a bunny yeah, like a rabbit face, and seeds fall out of his face. like I said, it's a very trippy thing. I wonder if I had what it would have been like if I had discovered drugs before reading this. Like, just like so it was yeah, like very interesting to read. And it has also like one of my favorite images that I remember as a kid in a comics at the end of issue 3, where Julie and Max, after like a big part of her trauma is revealed, and she's talking to Max, and it's just these two little small panels from behind of them sitting next to each other. And then she leans her head on his shoulder and says, "I'm going to be just fine." And that I remember was always like a very emotional thing for me, where like I think it was the first time where like a comic really emotionally hit me more so than any other like superhero comic. So yeah, and so basically it goes from there and you get all kinds of stuff where then like Julie starts going into this outback world and delving into her own psyche as well. And yeah, there's a lot of great stuff. There's even interesting things. It's almost like in issue 6 has like a pronouns mention that almost is like sort of like very like beyond the non-binary before that was talked about, where someone there's this like character, the dragon, that gets introduced as like, "Hey, you're the dragon. That's my pronoun, son," kind of thing, or like that. So it's I don't know, like it's very interesting. I thought it was really cool, and it'll be cool to hear what you guys think about what happens in the future with this character, because yeah, it really goes down, pun intended, the rabbit hole, so to speak, of their psyche, and with the other characters involved, and you see more of like really get more into Sarah's character as well, and like what's going on with her mentally. Yeah. And yeah, you sort of solve of like find out like, what happened with the Max and why there's this outback world and all that.
Yeah. Thank you very
I
much for that, Dan.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks, Dan. It's a very like you said, trippy. It's very 90s in a lot of ways. Like
Mm.
those outfits that Julie's wearing, it's just like, oh, club kid chic, like going to a
Yeah.
rave. But it comes right out of the gate. Like it doesn't handhold you, which I thought was a nice change from a lot of its contemporaries. Because I mean, all three of the books that we're talking about that are older books are all basically from the exact same time.
Yeah, like
Um,
1993, 1994, and like
yeah,
5-ish. Yeah.
92,
Yeah,
93,
true.
94. Yeah, so they're all kind of contemporaneous. Um, and it's like very different storytelling techniques across all three of them. Um, but yeah, like this doesn't hold your hand. Like it's adult in that it's telling an adult story, but it's not adult in that it's gratuitous in its expression of violence or grief or pain or anything.
Mm. I
Yeah.
was worried. I was like, "Oh no, am I going to discover that like this is problematic and hasn't aged well?" And then I was like, "All right, phew, I think it's pretty good
Yeah.
still."
And I mean, I think that's the interesting thing is like because I mean, it's funny. There is a Sandman reference in here too, when
Right.
Sarah comes in. But like that's the thing. It treats it in a mature manner because like you have the conversation where Max and Julie are talking about indecent proposal,
Right.
and going into feminist theory on about that, and you have like Glory and Julie sunbathing, Glory being Sarah's mom, sunbathing and talking about violence in media, intercut with an issue where Max is like, or no, sorry, the follow up issue to that. Max watched too many cartoons and his like exploring his trauma via a dream where he's a cartoon and it shifts art styles. It's
Yes.
just
Yeah.
it experiments so much and it's really cool.
Yeah, like going from like like everything that he says is a rhyme, and it's like this
Yeah.
messed up kind of cartoon world that he's in, but it's still as violent. He's still getting like chased by the is
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 this
um
I think.
is
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah, it made me feel like I grew up from like superhero, like of course we've talked about the Strange Academy, like it made me feel like, oh, like they think that I'm ready to like handle this level of comic storytelling, but in such an interesting way that the trauma, like you said, like didn't feel exploitative. It felt like it was an exploration, and in the end, when they say that they're in Julie's psyche, um and that it's like this is the place where you go when you've something has happened to you, and it's like you can't quite go back from that. It was very eye opening, and it really hit me
Mm.
um in a way that a comic never has before. So yeah, yeah.
And it even explores parasocial relationships in an interesting way at the closing, where he's talking about the cancellation of Cheers and
Yeah.
how these characters are kind of dead and now, and the actors are fine, but that relationship, which is, it is a different time. A lot of people, younger people, don't necessarily appreciate the fact that there was a time when couldn't really go back and just watch something. Like these people
Right.
who are a part of your life every week for like 30 minutes, bring you this joy, they're gone effectively. And yeah, it's like a lot of the themes Keith deals with, not just in the Max, but in his other works like Ojo and My Inner Bimbo, which that was supposed to be a trilogy of different works, and that was his Trotaverse because everything had a verse for a while there. Um, but they all deal with grief, trauma, and self identity, which is like it's interesting because this seems to be like is, and even if you go back to Sandman, the art around that, it kind of is. There's a lot of the similar themes. Um, but yeah, like Ojo was basically a study of trauma, and then Minor Bimbo is a character where there's a guy who's in denial of his feminine side, and then it manifests, and he as an external being. And I mean, that kind of ties back in a lot of ways to Julie and her externalization of her grief by overcorrecting in a way, where she's externalizing that, like, no, I will be this because nobody's going to stop me. Um,
Mm.
which is just, it's interesting. It's like you don't see this often, if ever.
Yeah. And it's very I found it was very nuanced because you have, like, the kind of like, like, you can see that Julie like, even what Julie's saying is almost different than what she's thinking because she's
Yeah.
saying, like, like, "Oh, like, you can't just blame, like, it's your fault if you have, like, something bad happen to you, whatever." But then you can see that it really is more her just trying to this is her trying to deal with what happened to her, being like, like, instead of her realizing, she was the circumstance of just, something horrible that happened to her, being like, like, "No, no, no, no. I have to, like, take responsibility. I can't just, deal with that trauma." And then that's why it gets pushed down into this outback world and
Yeah.
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 Uh,
And I mean, I think that that's something that you don't often see, is this reflection of how trauma affects people differently. Like,
mhm.
if at a surface read, and I mean, I think this is one of the sad parts about some of the comedians out there in the world. On a surface read, I'm like, "Oh, geez, this is just a really horrible misogynistic take," because it's like I've seen people say those same kinds of things, but not in
Yeah.
a nuanced way. But then when you like read through the story, it's like it's clearly indicating that, like, no, her words and her thoughts are two different things, and her words are a defensive shield to protect her from that trauma, to protect her from actually processing grief and pain and stuff. In a way that I find
Mhm.
really compelling. A really interesting, creative piece of art that you don't often see.
Yeah. You teach, like, a psychology in the Max, like, college, like, university course almost on this.
Yeah.
Absolutely could. It'd be required reading, and it would be very effective. I don't know. It felt very modern in a way. Like this is the conversation we're having now, and I'm
Yeah.
glad that it didn't age poorly and terribly in that sort of way.
Yeah, I was like, phew, still relevant.
All right. Well, yeah, so we've been talking about the Maxx. So thanks for joining us on Detecting the Marvelous, and we'll see you soon. You've been listening to Detecting the Marvelous, a Far From Here and ShowbizMonkeys.com co-production. Your producers are Dan Rosen, Matt Erdill, and Shaharah Ghaznavi. Music by Glenn Bouchamp, and art by Ben Steamroller. Thanks for listening, and remember, true believers, Excelsior!